My name is Eric, and before I go any further, what I would like to do is very briefly and in a very subtle way point you at my timeline. So if you want to look at the slides, so my slides are online. I tend to put links into my slides. They're browser-based. So if you go to my timeline, my last or second last tweet or something like that will have a link to the slides. I think they will also be linked from the organization page. So you can do that. And very briefly about myself, why I'm here. I'm here because Karthik invited me. Thank you very much. And so we wrote a book. It's about continuous API management. So it's about APIs, and we have more books, and I will give away some of them. So be alert. So myself, I'm a tech person. I come from a computer science and networking background. And for the last 2.5 years until the beginning of this year, I worked in a small group that was called the API Academy, and we wrote a book. Now I work at a different company. It's called Good API, so if you need a good API, you can get in touch with me. But that's a different story. So we wrote a book. It came out by the end of last year, which was kind of unfortunate timing because at that point, CA, I don't know how many of you know, but CA was acquired and restructured. And basically when the book came out that my group and I wrote together to kind of serve as a little bit of a, let's say, advertising for the company and our API competence, everything was changed and we all moved to different jobs. But anyway, so the book was released, that's nice. And what I would like to talk about a little bit is a little bit of a higher level view of APIs, not so much just very down to handling the network traffic and so forth. Of course, that is necessary. But I want to talk a little bit more from the experience that I've had talking to companies who want to adopt APIs, what they see as their main problem, and what they also are looking for when they figure out how to use APIs in their organization. The book, like I said, is available, and I will give away some books here. I bought 4 with me. I will ask some questions along the way. I will give books away. If you just want to get an intro to the book, you can also get the first 3 chapters for free. NGINX has sponsored this and made it available for downloads. So if you just want to get a feel for the book, you can download the first 3 chapters at this address. And once again, all of this is online, so you can go there later. Okay, now, like I said, mostly what I want to talk about is a little bit my perspective of APIs, how I encountered big organizations trying to move towards APIs, so to speak, and wondering why would we do it, what would we need to do, what would we have to keep in mind. And the way I do this, and in my previous job, I literally traveled the globe, striking fear in the hearts of organizations about digital transformation. Okay, so that's often where we came in, companies saying, yes, we understand digital transformation, we need probably to do something, tell us what to do. Or sometimes very literally asking, what are others doing? We probably should be doing the same. So we did that in a variety of places. So this, and we did a lot of presentations for sometimes more for the business side of things, sometimes more for the IT side of things. And I tried to localize my presentations. So these are some examples from the places where I had some presentations around APIs and digital transformation. So this was on the West Coast, somewhere in America. Crocodile was Australia. Right top hand side, of course, Japan, Godzilla. That was South America. That was somewhere in Europe. And this is the price for the first book goes to the price of, where was this? Any guesses where this present? Not in the middle of the ocean, but where could that have been? South Africa, yes, there you go. Please, okay, you can collect your book later. I'll give away some more. So, digital transformation everywhere. And whenever we talk to companies, right, very often you got to this feeling that, what is it even? And I recently ran into a really nice definition. There's a lot of definitions out there, but I really like that one. It's from a Harvard Business Review, recently published article that simply says, digital transformation means adapting an organization's strategy and structure to capture opportunities enabled by digital technology. That is wonderfully simple. Of course, it leaves a lot of room for interpretation, but it's really very clear in saying it just means to be better living and surviving in a digital world, right? And what it means to be digital somehow translates to the digital world tends to change faster than worlds before it, so to speak, tended to change. Also, because it changes faster, I want to be more nimble in terms of how I can adapt to different things and say, maybe today I'm doing this, tomorrow I want to do this, tomorrow I understand, oh, now there's this new device coming out, I probably should have a channel for that. Do I need to rebuild everything just to serve that channel? Hopefully not, right? So you need more flexibility to deal with that increasing complexity of how to serve all the different channels that you have in your digital world. And what that translates to, right, means that your organization kind of needs to adapt to that higher speed and higher flexibility. And because the world is digital, right, IT needs to be aligned with that. And that's the biggest challenge for most organizations, that traditionally, right, there's this huge waterfall process. The organization does something, hands it over to IT builds something, and at some point in time delivers it, and then it's kind of good enough for the next 3 years. And that doesn't really work anymore. And what we saw happening a lot is organizations being in this situation where you have some business people saying, yeah, we probably need digital transformation. We want all of this, right? That sounds all good. And probably if we don't do it, we run into trouble. But it's kind of hard to actually do it. So the next book goes to, where is it at? Grand Canyon. Okay, next book's going there. And that's actually me, okay? So that's me standing there. So there's like one day we had this wonderful idea we want to run across. Great idea. But it was the same kind of thing, right? It sounds like a good idea, but then you're there, it's like, it's probably tricky. So, right, how do you get it done, right? What do you need to do? How do you need to prepare? How can you actually make it happen, right? So you need to think through the steps so that it actually works in the end. So it's not that easy. I mean, it's doable, right? But you need a plan, and you need to execute the plan, and then you have a pretty good chance of making it. And we did make it. And sometimes it's interesting. So I went to this one really large organization, and they went from this, like, we probably need digital transformation, then somehow, somewhere, somebody read about APIs, that they're kind of important. So they said, yes, APIs, we should have APIs. And then they got in touch with CA back then, because CA was selling API software. So we came in there, and then we asked them, well, what's your plan, around creating APIs, managing APIs, having kind of an API culture where different teams communicate through APIs. And they had like zero. It was amazing. It was really, they said, digital transformation, we need APIs. And then the next step, literally in like a 100-slide presentation, was digital transformation, then some dollar signs along the way, then APIs, and then the next step, we're going agile. That solves all problems. And so they, at some point, they understood that, yes, probably we need a little bit finer grained strategy, how to actually do that. And that was one of the experiences that led us to kind of think about how can we give organizations like a better framework to really make this journey a little bit more structured and understand what to do, okay? And that's what I want to talk about. And one of the things that I've always struggled with, depending on the audience, but because I struggled with it for such a long time and I like this analogy, I wanted to show you this one. So my analogy for APIs now has become beer, okay? So what you do, the value that you create is the beer, and the API is just the delivery mechanism, okay? So the API is either can or the tap or the bottle, right? So you still need to be good at brewing beer, but you also need to be probably good at how you get it to your customers, or you will be very limited in who you can get to, right? And You need both sides. So, and one of the important things is always to keep in mind that if you just create great delivery mechanisms, but you don't really have any value to deliver, that's kind of pointless, right? So APIs really are not the answer to your problem. They're just one thing you need to get right if you want to be successful. And next slide has my next question on it. I have a, well, this is not so much, I think, an API crowd here, but who here has heard of GraphQL? Ah, at least some of you. Thank you. So GraphQL is kind of the new hipster API thing. And so this is kind of GraphQL in the beer analogy. Okay, something where you're not quite sure why it needs to exist. But somehow it's the new cool thing. Bottle made of aluminum. But the beer in it is still, I don't know how you feel about it, but anyway, so GraphQL is something that nowadays really is kind of the new way to deliver stuff, right? But in the end, it's not really, to me, not all that exciting. Maybe it is a better way of doing some things, but again, it's kind of just a different packaging. So the background in that picture, the next book. Nope. Further south? Yes, that's a little bit too coarse-grained. No. California. We were in California. One more. No, it's Mono Lake. I thought maybe the island can give it away, but yeah, whatever. So, you have the same lake? Oh, yeah. Maybe that works better in California. It probably does. Okay. So one of the things I'm always trying to tell when I tell my API stories is really that sometimes people really get to this impression that, yes, once we have APIs, everything is going to be great. And that is not the case, right? So if you just think that APIs are going to solve all your problems, that of course is not the case. So you read all these reports, I don't know if you've seen them, like McKinsey and all the large strategy consultancies write all these reports about like terrible figures of digital transformation success, right? Companies engaging in digital transformation initiatives and then failing, like 75% of them failing, right? And sometimes, I think, sadly, there's not a good analysis parts in these reports, but to me, in many cases, it's because they just focus on technology, right? They think if we get the technology right, everything's going to be great, right? And that's really, I think, a big problem, because in many cases, you also need to make sure that you have the right team structure, you need to have the right business mindset to actually do it, you need to allow initiatives within the company to fail and deal with that and all these kind of things, right? So it's really not that easy to get the things right. So APIs are important and they are a necessary thing to get right if you want to succeed in digital transformation, but they're not sufficient. And the last book, so we had three, the last book goes to that movie. Zoolander. Who was Zoolander? We had several Zoolanders. Okay. Okay. We also need to give away the monologue. We do that after the talk. Okay, good. But keep that in mind, okay? Just doing APIs won't really do a lot for you if you don't keep in mind the other things. So what we've come up with now at Good API is this model where we say, yes, it's important to look at technology, but you also need to look at business and organizational aspects. And one of the important things of digital transformation also means that you're constantly doing this transformation part. That's another thing that you notice over time when you talk to organizations in digital transformation. They really have this mindset of just tell me what to do so I can get done with it, and then I'll just do whatever I want to do. And when you try to tell them, no, digital transformation is not a thing you do and then you're done with it. It's turning into something and then doing that for the rest of your existence. And that is, I think, a mindset that in many organizations it's kind of really hard to understand, that you have to change as an organization constantly, right? You have to transform into something that's ready to change, and then you have to keep changing. right? In response to input from the outside world that tells you we don't want this anymore, we want more of this, we want more of this, we use these devices, right? So that's really hard for many organizations to do because they're not used to this kind of fast and constantly changing environment. So that's what we see as one of the big challenges. So the way we've tried to address that a little bit when we wrote the book, so the book is not so much about technology, it's really mostly about what's the mindset that you should have in terms of APIs so that you can really leverage them as an essential, not the only, but one essential part of your digital transformation. And the two things that we cover are API products and API landscapes. So API products are the individual capabilities that you have in your organization, and you develop them as products. You give them an API, right? Remember, that's the beer and the packaging. And then you have many of those products. In large organizations, you have thousands, sometimes even tens of thousands of APIs. And at some point, these are landscapes. We call them landscapes because we wanted to make sure that there's this idea of variety, right? It's not something that is highly controlled. It evolves over time. It changes all the time. There's a lot of external factors influencing how things evolve in that environment. And what you want to make sure is that this environment is as productive as you can make it. So that's the main thrust of the book, is trying to have these stories of how can you continuously work in an environment where you have APIs that develop, where you have the landscape that develops, you have APIs being added to the landscape, APIs disappearing from the landscape, and you have new applications that get written that depend on APIs and hopefully don't break every time that something changes, right? So you also need a mindset where developers of applications start writing more resilient applications because the environment becomes more complex. So all of this has gone into the book. We have a variety of models that we present. One of them is the traditional API product lifecycle, so the idea that as any other product, API products have a life cycle, right? So you have create, publish, realize, maintain, retire phases. For some reason, we created an image for that where the retirement spawns a new creation. I don't know why. But that's how it works in that image. And APIs, to some extent, are products like other products in the sense that many products have this life cycle. But they're a little bit different because they're not products that you deliver and you're done with them, right? You continuously deliver them, right? So there's a continuous relationship between you and a consumer. So when you change the product, that affects the consumer. So what you want to avoid is an environment where when you make a change because you improve the API, existing consumers break, right? And that happens quite a bit because technical solutions often are brittle, right? And there's API design practices that you can have to avoid, this, but it's something you need to establish in the organization, right? Where you need to teach people this is a good way to design APIs, this is a not so good way to design APIs, right? So it's something where you need to start establishing principles that help this API landscape to be more friendly to developers living in this landscape. And you also want to maybe have different, for example, requirements and policies where you say, if we create and we publish APIs for test cases and just internal usage, we have different policies. For example, we apply different security policies than we have when we make them available for outside consumption, right? So the life cycle also helps you to understand how important is that API right now, how do I need to manage that? One interesting distinction that we also often see is the distinction between external and internal APIs. And to me, that's really fascinating. So sometimes you have conversations with companies talking about APIs that are almost exclusively around external APIs. So an organization exposing APIs to the outside world, and sometimes really just like, how can we make money with this, right? Teach us how to make money with APIs. And that often is not a good mindset. There are some companies making money directly in APIs, but these are very few, right? A lot of companies do not really make their money through selling API access. They make money because they do something, and then they also have APIs to help them doing this something better, right? So in many cases, this external view is really a little bit too kind of reduced in my view, but it sometimes is, I would say, the result of people reading about something that often is called the API economy, right, where basically money now can be charged because you just sell API access, which exists, but like I said, it's more like a special case. The other perspective that some organizations are taking, and that often is much more when you talk to people coming from the IT side, is this idea of internally decomposing the organization into smaller parts, right? So that's maybe the microservices angle. That's all this thing where you say we want to take the organization apart into smaller pieces that are communicating so that we can more easily change these pieces, we can add new pieces, we can remove pieces, we can rearrange pieces, build new things out of the existing pieces. Both of these perspectives are interesting and valid. Sometimes there's too much focus on just one of them and not enough understanding that they're essentially the same thing. Right? So what I want to encourage you to do is whenever you encounter kind of discussions where people talk about APIs and you have the feeling that the discussion just focuses exclusively on one of these two things, try to also look at the other side. One interesting example, right, this is really famous. So who of you here has heard from this Jeff Bezos service mandate? Some of you? Okay, some of you, okay. It's from 2002. That's, to me, the amazing thing, right? So this is Bezos, the Amazon CEO, even back then. And what he said was, from now on, everything that we do within Amazon needs to be an API, basically. Back then, people didn't say API, but that's basically what he said. And this is why we have Amazon Web Services nowadays, right? So back then, actually, Amazon was just a web shop, just an online store, and they started to build up internal storage and compute services so that they could better run their web shop. And then, because Jeff Bezos is a smart man, he discovered, probably, he thought about, right, well, maybe we can sell these things, right? We have a lot of that, so maybe we can sell it. If we design it right, selling it later on won't be super hard, but we have to think about what we might want to do in the future, right? So that's kind of digital transformation really per mandate. That was kind of easy because Amazon is really very, very, very top down, right? And famously, which I don't have on here, right? But basically these were the rules that were given. And it said, okay, you people get to work. And if you don't do it, you're fired. And the other interesting thing, I can't go into any details about this, right? But it's also to understand that this was really, really hard. It took years and it was super expensive. Right? It was not something where you just say, oh, let's do this, and then suddenly you're getting rich because you have Amazon Web Services. It was really hard, in particular also because in 2002, there wasn't the kind of product choice that you have nowadays that would help you to do that more easily. But if you look at the long-term effect that had, right, that was pretty nice. It worked very well for the company, right? But it was really a long-term vision with a strong perspective on what you want to do and really keep doing it. And then in the end, it actually was successful. So of course, also it could have failed, and there probably are many stories where this failed, right? But this is an example where really this thing was a very kind of visionary way of looking forward for how we can use things. So what I now try to tell people they do APIs, and I'm very proud of this animation, I did it myself, which is why you have to endure it now running permanently, is that when you work with APIs, right, it's a good idea to at least potentially think about APIs as not necessarily being internal or externally accessible by nature, but just that's a decision that you make at some point in time, right, where you say, oh, these are services right now that we just buy because we don't want to develop them, and maybe later on you're saying, yeah, now actually we don't want to buy this API anymore because it's expensive to have as an external service, so we develop our own, right? So this really should just be kind of a monetary and economical decision whether you have something that you develop as your own API or something that you buy. Of course, all of this needs to be taken with a grain of salt, hence the giant salt shaker. And but what I find fascinating, and that would be a talk in itself, I think, but I don't have time for that. But and I also want the price for the oldest citation. This one is from 1937. If you have that here in the conference, that's not a bad one. So that's a fascinating. So that's like an economist, and he wrote a book called The Nature of the Firm. And the interesting part, like this book basically discussed why are there firms, right? Why do firms even exist? Like if the market is such a great thing, why do firms even exist? And the reasoning behind that, and I know now you're all busy reading that. Shame on me to put so much text on the slide. The reason why firms exist is that sometimes it's cheaper to do things in an organization because you can organize them better, you can integrate and optimize them better than acquiring things on the market, right? So a firm is just an optimization mechanism where you bundle up what makes sense to optimize and you still get from the outside what you don't want to optimize. So coming back to this picture, right? So this is really depending on how you see the economic benefit, like the way in which you either externalize APIs and use them from the outside or use them from the inside is really just a question of what makes sense for me economically. And when the business people in the company say we should not consume this API anymore, we should build it, then hopefully the IT side can actually make that happen relatively quick because you thought about it beforehand. Okay. And before I joined CA, I worked on web architecture for a long time. So I spent a lot of time basically thinking about how does the web work? Because the web is just fascinating, right? It's by far kind of the biggest technical system ever built by mankind, and it kind of works. And when I started at CA, my first task was basically to familiarize myself with microservices, which back then were a big thing, about a little over 3 years ago. They were kind of on the rise. And to me, it was kind of fascinating because I thought, well, that's how the web works, right? That's basically the enterprise IT understanding web architecture. To me, that's what microservices are, nothing more, right? If you have something, turn it into a self-contained service. If it's successful, it will grow. If nobody wants it, it will die. And that's how the world works, right? That's very simple and very effective, right? You say everything that you build as a self-contained thing. Whoever builds it gets to build it the way they like it, and then they run it. And if it's successful, they have to make sure it still runs. And if it's not successful, then we'll just switch it off, right? That's how the web works, right? You program your web thing any way you like, and then you have to make sure it runs. And that really is, to me, like this interesting thing where you say now that enterprises, the IT representation of enterprises gets bigger and bigger, the enterprise needs to get away from this, like we build it as a system, and more understand that it's actually an ecosystem that we need to design and cultivate. And in that ecosystem, the APIs are the core mechanism, right, that help all these pieces to communicate. So the APIs really become the fundamental thing that you have and must make sure that it works for you. So this is what you end up with then, the API landscape. So the idea that once you are a big organization, you have many of these capabilities being around, all of them are APIs. The only thing that you can work with are APIs. Whatever you build will be presented as an API. So essentially, your organization just becomes that. It's nothing but a set of APIs, right? If it's not an API, it doesn't matter. Whatever you do represent as an API. And then in that landscape, what you need to do, and so I tried to kind of visualize how what we call continuous API management actually works. So the way it works is really to say that you have this landscape here and you observe what's going on. So you see all the people in your organization building APIs in different ways, whatever way they want to, maybe, different maybe technological pockets here and there. You see what they're doing and then you try to either help them doing it. So you establish these things such as API platforms, API platform teams that start building tooling for the individual teams that actually build APIs. And you also try to enforce some constraints, right? So security was an example that was given. Some other constraints may be that you want to have logging done in a certain way because you want to make sure that you can kind of have access to what's going on in your network and so forth, right? So you try to have that balance, and that is the tricky part for all these large organizations, right? You want a lot of freedom and a lot of autonomy for your teams so that they can be more productive and create better products. But you also need some constraints so that they do stupid things, that they don't do stupid things, and that they do things that, for example, follow legislation, regulation, and policy. For that, sometimes you have explicit constraints, and sometimes you also have these wonderful things that you see increasingly happening, which I call implicit constraints. And one of these examples is, some of you may have heard about that Netflix Chaos Monkey. Anybody here familiar with that? Yeah, right? Chaos Monkey is genius. And there's similar things out there. Even there's Gremlin out there. There's a company basically trying to do something like that, similar, a little bit more flexible. So Chaos Monkey is the idea that because you can tell your developers until you're blue in the face that they should develop resilient code, they still won't do it, right? Because it's hard. But if you have an environment where chaos sometimes happens and their code will be detected because it misbehaves in that environment, you can flag it basically, right? So you have a test basically to find code that's not resilient, right? So that's a constraint that is implicit basically because you don't have to tell your developers that they need to develop resilient code. You just find out when they don't, right? So that's one of these constraints that as somebody who's in charge of an API landscape, you have to figure out what are the constraints that I want to define and how do I actually implement them, right? And for the constraints that you define, you should have ways how you support them, how you can test for them, how you help people to actually satisfy them, right? And that, in the end, will give you the landscape that you like with the maximum productivity and the necessary number of constraints that you think you should have so that your landscape makes you happy, right, and rich. And in order to do that, right, there's kind of various axes of continuity. So there's like product development. These are a little bit more, I guess, regular. So the whole DevOps story, right? Like the ability to fix things fast, but also the ability to evolve a product fast without breaking everybody. So that's a discipline that you need to have. Landscape continuity. We have published a lot about that. So there's a link in there you can follow to discover more how we think you can actually evolve landscapes continually. Scope continuity, that you can say whether something is external or internal. I can play around with that depending on what's the nature of the firm. And also architectural continuity. So the idea of how can I actually have this landscape and evolve my rules, add constraints, remove constraints, add tools, remove tools, right? That actually is a challenging thing for an architect nowadays. It's a different task compared to an architect from 10 years ago. But it's something that's still needed, right? Somebody who can actually do that. And one pattern that a lot of companies are following, right? That's just one example that we give, is, for example, having a gateway, right? You don't need to have a gateway, but that's a pattern that successfully allows you to satisfy some of the constraints, implementing security and so forth. So that's something that a lot of companies now are choosing to do because a gateway is a component that can do a number of things. There are a variety of kind of configurations how you can deploy it. That, again, is a different thing. But at least it's something that seems to be a pattern that more and more is used in these landscapes. And with that, my conclusion to that is that APIs really are kind of I call them the connective fabric of sort of the digitally transformed organization, right? They are the stuff that makes everything talk to each other. And in order to really understand where you want to go and where you stand, when we talk to organizations, we have developed what we call compasses. These are just our internal tools. But I think it's important to at least think about all these things, right? So do you have an API strategy? So why do we even have APIs, right? Sometimes it's amazing. We talk to organizations that talk to us and say, tell us more about APIs. And then we ask them, why are you interested in APIs? And they don't even know. It's like sometimes it's pretty fascinating. So why do you want to have APIs, right? It's hard to assess whether you are successful with your API strategy when you don't have one. More and more companies are having API programs, trying to build API platforms, right? So they understand that in order to maximize team productivity, you need to support them with an API platform. You also need to understand how your landscape is doing. You want some checkpoints. You want to understand, am I doing the right thing? Are there certain technologies I should be watching? Is everybody asking for different things? Where am I going? You also might have certain needs of checking API products. So if you're developing products, for example, that are high profile, where you really think that you will have a lot of external customers using them, maybe you want to go through like a review phase where you talk about, is that good, is that bad, how easy is it to use? Some companies are investing a lot in DX, developer experience, and documentation, these kind of things. And also, last but definitely not least, since you have more and more APIs in your organization, it's really important to tell everybody what that means for developers. So consuming APIs is easy, hopefully, if you have well-designed APIs, but it is a decentralized system that you're building, meaning that you have to take into account that certain parts can be failing, can be slow, can be oscillating in their behavior, and hopefully other components will not be influenced by that too much, right? So there is a certain discipline you need to understand that implementing things in a distributed ecosystem is different than implementing things on a single computer, right? And that is also something that you need to keep in mind. Okay, with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. Again, the slides are online at this address. You can also find them, I think, or you can find the link in the app from the conference. Thanks a lot. If there's any question, please, maybe we have a minute or two. And also for all of you who were answering the questions right, please come and get your books. Any questions? No? Okay. Well, in that case, I think it's time for coffee, right? Break? Okay. And I'll be around.